Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. I'd always thought I was different from other people. Where they saw danger, I saw opportunity. Where they heard warnings, I heard challenge. That's why, when I came across the ad for a small, rundown Victorian house nestled on the outskirts of rural Pennsylvania, I saw it as the perfect escape. A house to call my own, a place where I could focus on my thesis. I was a psychology student, after all, and sleep paralysis and hallucinations had always intrigued me. It seemed like the ideal location to study, distant from distractions, with plenty of time to think and write. The house, though. There was something about it that tugged at the edges of my curiosity. It sat alone atop a small hill, surrounded by thick woods, the type of woods that seemed to whisper when the wind picked up. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, mentioning it was unlucky and haunted. Superstitions, I told myself. The house was cheap, in excellent condition for its age, and had a charm that no amount of local gossip could undo. It was perfect for my needs, even if the people in town didn't seem to share my enthusiasm. I arrived on a Tuesday, after a long drive, and my first impression was that the house had a certain imposing beauty. The wooden exterior was weathered, with dark trim and ivy creeping up the walls, as though it were trying to reclaim the structure from the earth itself. The front door creaked open as I pushed it inside, the scent of dust and old wood filling my nostrils. There was a slight chill in the air, but nothing I couldn't ignore. It was the kind of house that made you feel small, but in a way that was almost comforting. Like it was a reminder of how much larger the world was than any of us. I went to the upstairs bedroom to settle in for the night. The house had been vacant for years, so I didn't expect much in the way of comfort. The bed was simple, the sheets unwashed and thin, but that was fine. I'd slept in worse conditions while traveling. I unpacked my things, placed my laptop on the small desk by the window, and cracked open a book about the psychology of sleep disorders. The wind howled outside, the trees rattling against the window like they were trying to get in. That first night, I heard it. The scraping sound. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it seemed to come from above. My mind immediately jumped to the possibility of raccoons or some other small creature in the attic. It was an old house, after all, and the sound was nothing I hadn't heard before. I was tired from the long drive, and the last thing I wanted was to waste energy on something so trivial. I dismissed it as the house settling and rolled over to sleep. But then came the voice. Soft, barely a whisper, just audible enough to send a chill down my spine. Marissa, I froze, my eyes snapping open. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't the wind. That voice was real. My heart raced, and I instinctively looked around the room, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The house creaked again, the wind picked up, but the voice didn't come back. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The following days were uneventful, or at least they seemed to be. I dove into my research with a single-mindedness that made it easy to ignore the unsettling feeling that clung to me, like an invisible weight on my shoulders. I would wake up each morning, the chill of the room still hanging in the air, and remind myself that I was here to study. The house was an afterthought, just a place to rest my head at night. But as the days passed, things started to shift. The scraping noises returned, more persistent this time, louder, almost as if whatever was up there was trying to get my attention. I made a mental note to check the attic, but the thought of going up there made my skin crawl. So I kept myself busy, distracting my mind with books, articles, and my thesis, but the unease never fully left. That night, the nightmares started. At first, it was just a vague sense of something being wrong. A figure lurking in the corner of my vision, an impression of eyes watching me from the darkness. But over the next few nights, they became clearer, more vivid. I dreamt of a man, a tall, shadowed figure with yellow, glowing eyes. He stood at the foot of my bed, motionless, staring at me as I lay paralyzed, unable to scream. I could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking, drilling into me. And when I finally managed to move, he was gone, leaving nothing but the lingering dread in my chest. I woke up in a cold sweat every morning, my heart pounding in my chest. My skin was marked with deep scratches, long red lines that I couldn't explain. They didn't hurt, but they were there, bright and fresh, as if I had scratched myself in my sleep. I told myself it was nothing, that I must have done it in my sleep while tossing and turning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. Then there was the smell. It started as a faint odor, one I could almost convince myself was just my imagination. Decay, like something old and forgotten. It would come and go, lingering in the corners of the rooms, in the hallway, and worst of all, in my bedroom. Some nights it would be so strong that I had to open the window to get some fresh air, but even then it wouldn't go away. It was as though the house itself was rotting, decaying from the inside out. I knew I had to investigate. The logical part of me told me to find a scientific explanation, to prove it wasn't a ghost or some supernatural force. So I began researching the history of the house. The more I uncovered, the darker it became. The house had been built in the late 1800s, long before my time, and there was very little about its origins in the town records. But what I did find, a snippet buried deep in the archives of the local library, caught my attention. In the late 19th century, a priest named Father Callahan had been called to the house to perform an exorcism on a young girl named Annabelle. According to the account, she had been possessed by something terrible, something powerful, that dwelled in the attic. Annabelle had died during the exorcism, her screams echoing through the house. The priest, deeply disturbed by what he had witnessed, was found days later hanging from a rafter in the attic, his eyes gouged out. The townspeople whispered that the demon, or whatever it was, had followed him to his death. The house had stood silent after that, its doors locked and its windows sealed, until the recent renovations that allowed it to be rented out. But the history of the house, the dark energy that seemed to hang over it, couldn't be ignored. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the story pressing down on me. I had to know more. But as I researched, the unease grew, as if the house itself were watching me, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. I had to know more. The story of Annabelle and Father Callahan gnawed at me. Was this really just superstition, or was there some truth to the haunting rumors that clung to this place? I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to dig deeper into the history of the house, find some kind of tangible explanation for what was happening to me, or I'd lose my mind. But every time I thought about the attic, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The house seemed to breathe in time with my fear, the walls creaking in protest as I considered confronting whatever lay up there. I decided to visit the town's historian, Charles, an older man who seemed to know everything there was to know about the area. When I arrived at his small, cluttered office, he looked at me with an odd mix of suspicion and curiosity. His eyes darted nervously to the door behind me, as though he were waiting for someone, or something, to appear. "You're asking about the house on the hill," he said without preamble, his voice low and careful. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unsure of how to start. I'm studying sleep disorders, sleep paralysis, and hallucinations. The house is a good place to focus, but I've started noticing strange things happening. Sounds, smells, and, well, I think I'm having nightmares. I found some records about a girl named Annabelle and a priest who died in the attic. Can you tell me more about that? Charles stared at me for a long moment, his eyes flicking to the window, then to the door again. He sighed heavily, almost as if he had been expecting me. "You're too young to understand what you're asking, but you're persistent. Fine, I'll tell you, though I don't want you to come back here asking for more. The house is cursed, you hear me? You don't know what you're dealing with." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Annabelle was a poor girl, not much different from the others around here at the time. But there was something wrong with her. They brought Father Callahan in after the symptoms became impossible to ignore. She wasn't just sick. She wasn't just possessed. There was something ancient in that attic, something evil. I listened intently as he continued, my stomach turning. The exorcism failed. They say Father Callahan was the one who went mad. The last time anyone saw him alive, he was muttering in Latin, staring at the ceiling of the attic, just before he hung himself. Some folks claim he was driven mad by the demon in that house, but I don't know. All I know is that it's bad, real bad. And everyone who's ever lived there, they've all changed. "Changed?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Charles looked at me, his gaze sharp. "That's what happens. People who live there, they start seeing things, hearing things, and then they change. They do things they can't explain. Some of them even leave, disappear, never to be seen again. The house doesn't just haunt you, it possesses you." I felt my breath catch in my throat. His words hit like a punch to the chest. Was I already starting to change? The nightmares, the scratching, the voice. I wasn't imagining it, was I? I couldn't back away now. I needed answers. I'm not leaving, I said, more firmly than I felt. What happened to Father Callahan? Is there anything else in the house that could help me understand? Charles hesitated, his eyes narrowing. There's only one way to get rid of it. You've got to burn it all down. Burn the house to the ground. That's the only way to stop the thing inside. I felt a shiver run through me. But he cut me off. Don't think you can solve it on your own. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can outsmart it. It's already inside you, isn't it? I can see it in your eyes. I stumbled back, his words cutting deeper than I could process. I'm fine. I just need to figure this out. I'll be okay. Charles stood up, his face grave. No, you're not. And when it's too late, don't come back here asking for help. I left his office with a sinking feeling in my stomach. Was I already too far gone? Had I already started to change in ways I didn't fully understand? The house had always felt like a place of isolation, a place for me to focus and finish my thesis. But now it felt more like a trap. I was being drawn deeper, pulled into something I couldn't escape. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, focusing instead on my research. But that night, when I lay in bed, I heard it again. The faint scraping sound from the attic. And this time, I didn't just hear it. I felt it. A presence, cold, watching. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and grabbed my flashlight. The air in the hallway was thick, suffocating, as if the house itself were alive, breathing around me. I made my way to the attic door, each step heavier than the last. But as I reached for the door, something stopped me. The whispering voice, soft but clear, filled my ears once more. Marissa. The voice was so close now, so unmistakably real that I could feel it brushing against my skin. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand as I tried to steady my breath. I turned toward the attic door, staring at the old, rusted knob. The shadows in the hallway stretched unnaturally long, warping in the dim light as if the house itself were alive, aware of my every movement. I could feel something, someone on the other side. But it wasn't just the weight of the silence that pressed in on me. It was the sudden awareness that whatever had been whispering my name wasn't human. It didn't belong here, it didn't belong anywhere, and yet it was calling to me. Marissa. The whisper echoed again, closer now, a dry rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very walls around me. I swallowed hard, my body refusing to move. The stories Charles had told me replayed in my mind. The possession, the madness, the terrible thing in the attic. Father Callahan had tried to rid the house of it, but he hadn't succeeded. The priest had become a victim, just like all the others. I raised my hand to the door, my fingers brushing against the cold wood. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and for a moment I almost turned back. But something inside me, something primal, urged me forward. I had to know. I had to see for myself what was waiting in that attic. My hand gripped the knob, and with a slow, deliberate motion, I twisted it open. The creaking of the hinges sent a shudder through me as I stepped into the dark space beyond. The attic was vast, filled with dusty old furniture and forgotten relics. Family heirlooms, abandoned memories, and something far more sinister lurking in the shadows. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and my flashlight flickered uncertainly as I swept it across the room. And there, in the farthest corner, I saw it. A shadow. It was tall and twisted, almost human, but its form was not quite right. It seemed to shift and stretch in unnatural ways, as if it were both there and not there at the same time. Its shape was indistinct, but there was no mistaking the eyes. Two glowing amber orbs that pierced the darkness and seemed to lock onto me with an unnatural hunger. I gasped, stumbling back, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. My heart raced, pounding against my chest, and I could feel the sweat collecting on my skin as the air grew colder. I tried to steady my breathing, trying to focus through the panic. But the thing in the corner wasn't moving. It was watching me, waiting. Marissa. The voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just from the shadows. It came from all around me, as if the very walls themselves were speaking. The shadow began to stir. It didn't step forward, but its shape seemed to pulse, undulating in the darkness. I felt it growing closer, despite its lack of movement. The room seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing into my mind. It was feeding on my fear, getting stronger with each passing second. I stumbled toward the stairs, desperately fumbling for the door handle, but my hand froze just before I could touch it. I couldn't leave. Not yet. The curiosity was too powerful. I had to know what this thing was, why it had chosen me. "Please," I whispered, my voice shaky. "What are you?" The shadow paused, as if considering my question. And then, in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it answered. "I am the past. I am the one who watches. I am the one who waits." The words sent a chill down my spine. My breath caught in my throat as a wave of nausea washed over me. The thing in the attic wasn't just haunting the house. It was the house. It was tied to it in ways I couldn't begin to understand, a parasite that had taken root in the very walls, feeding off the lives that had passed through. I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me, but the shadow began to move. Slowly, deliberately, shifting toward me with a single, terrifying purpose. "Leave," it rasped, and the words seemed to scrape across my mind like nails on a chalkboard. "Leave this place." I backed up against the wall, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to escape before it was too late. But as I reached for the door again, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. My body jerked as I was pulled to the floor, landing with a heavy thud. I looked down to find nothing. Nothing but the faint outline of a hand imprinted in the dust. And then the shadows reached for me. The shadows crept up my legs, cold and suffocating, like 1,000 unseen hands pulling me into the darkness. I screamed, my voice muffled by the thick air, but it felt like my words were swallowed by the house itself. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled, desperate to break free, but the more I fought, the stronger the grip became. The air around me grew colder, a biting chill that cut straight to my bones. I reached for the flashlight, still lying just beyond my outstretched fingers, but it was too far. My body was pinned immobile, as if the shadows themselves were feeding on my fear. I could feel them wrapping around me, binding me to the floor, and I knew then that this wasn't just a haunting. This was something far worse. I tried to scream again, but the sound caught in my throat as the figure in the corner of the attic stepped forward. It was no longer a shadow. It had solidified, taking on a human-like form, but its features were distorted, twisted beyond recognition. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, glowing amber, as if they were filled with something far darker than mere malice. "You shouldn't have come here," the thing whispered, its voice both soft and deafening at the same time. It didn't sound like a person. There was no humanity in it, only the cold, empty void of something ancient and malicious. The room seemed to pulse around it, as if the very air was alive with its presence. I gasped for air, trying to push against the invisible force that held me down, but it was no use. The thing was in my head now, its words echoing in my mind, clawing at my thoughts. "You are mine now. You have always been mine. The house will claim you as it has claimed all the others." The weight of those words pressed into my skull, making it feel as though my brain were going to explode. My thoughts scrambled, disjointed and frantic. I had to get out. I had to escape. But how? How could I escape something that had no form, no physical presence to fight? Something that had been here long before me and would remain long after. Then, through the haze of terror, I remembered Father Donnelly. He had warned me. He had known what this thing was, what it had done to others. I had to find him. I had to call for help. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I forced my hands to move. My fingers clawed at the floor, pushing against the unseen force that held me down. The thing in front of me chuckled, its voice a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Where will you go, Marissa? This house is my prison. You cannot leave." But I didn't care anymore. I had to try. Even if it was futile, even if I was only buying myself a few more moments, I had to fight. I had to escape. Somehow, I managed to crawl toward the stairs, my body moving in fits and starts, my limbs heavy and stiff from the pressure of the shadows. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, dragging steps. Father Donnelly. I had no time to think. I scrambled to my feet, half running, half crawling toward the door. My breath was ragged, my head spinning, and as I reached the hallway, I saw him. He was standing at the entrance to the attic, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Marissa, get out of here," he shouted, his voice trembling with urgency. But before I could respond, the house seemed to tremble, as if it were reacting to his presence. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked underfoot, and the shadows began to writhe, stretching out like tendrils, reaching for him. "No," I cried, stumbling toward him. "Father Donnelly, you have to leave." He shook his head, his face grim. "I've seen this before. It's too late for me. But you." He stopped himself, swallowing hard. "You have to burn it. Burn it all." I didn't understand at first. What did he mean? But then the air in the house shifted. It thickened as though the very presence of the entity was growing stronger. The temperature dropped again, and the walls seemed to close in, trapping us in its grip. I turned to look back at the stairs, my thoughts racing. The shadow was coming for us, and there was no time to waste. Father Donnelly's words were clear in my mind now, despite the overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to swallow me whole. Burn it. I had no idea what he meant, but I knew I couldn't let this house, or whatever was inside it, win. It had already taken too much from me. It had already taken too much from the people before me. I had to stop it. I ran to the kitchen, my feet barely touching the ground as I scrambled for anything that might help. My hands shook violently as I grabbed a bottle of lighter fluid from a cupboard, spilling most of it onto the floor as I sprinted back toward the attic. Father Donnelly was still standing there, unmoving, his eyes locked on the thing in the corner. "You have to hurry," he urged, his voice cracking, "before it's too late." But the shadows were closing in, and I realized then, with a sickening certainty, that if I didn't act now, we would never leave this house. The attic felt like a furnace now, the air thick and heavy, pressing against my chest with every breath. I stood there, trembling, staring at the bottle of lighter fluid in my hands. My palms were slick with sweat, my heart pounding in my ears. Father Donnelly was still standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear, watching the shadows crawl toward us like hungry beasts. I tried to steady my shaking hands, but they wouldn't obey. The force of the darkness in the room was suffocating, wrapping around me like 1,000 invisible chains, pulling me back toward the very thing I was trying to escape. I could hear the thing's laughter again, low and cruel, reverberating through the walls. "Do it, Marissa." Father Donnelly's voice cracked through the chaos, but his plea was drowned out by the horrible screech of the house's walls bending under the weight of something ancient and malevolent. The shadows stretched, reaching toward us, as if the house itself was alive, feeding off the terror that was choking the air. I felt a surge of determination. This had gone on long enough. I had no more time for fear. I had to do this. With a forceful breath, I swung the bottle of lighter fluid in a wide arc, dousing the wooden floor and the stairs leading to the attic door. The smell of the fluid mixed with the rotting decay of the house, filling the space with a stench so thick it made my stomach turn. "Marissa, be careful," Father Donnelly shouted, his voice full of desperation. But I didn't stop. I had come too far to turn back now. The shadows in the room seemed to recoil, as if they understood what was about to happen. But they wouldn't retreat completely. Instead, they began to surge faster, more violently, stretching toward me with renewed hunger. I could feel the air change, thickening with malevolent energy, as though the entire house was holding its breath. The thing that had taken residence in the attic, the thing that had driven everyone who lived here to madness, was cornered, its rage palpable, clawing at the very foundation of the house. I fumbled in my pocket for the matchbook I had grabbed from the kitchen, the edges of the paper frayed and worn. My fingers felt numb, as though the shadows themselves were trying to freeze me in place. But I forced myself to strike a match, watching as the tiny flame flickered to life in the dim, suffocating darkness. My hands shook violently as I lowered it to the soaked floorboards. The fire ignited in a sudden burst, spreading rapidly, devouring the fluid I had poured down, sending flames licking up the walls of the attic. The light was blinding, and for a moment I was thrown back by the heat, feeling it sear my skin even from several feet away. But I didn't look away. I couldn't. I had to watch. The shadows screamed, their shrill voices echoing in every corner of the house as the flames consumed them. The house groaned and cracked under the pressure, the walls shuddering violently as though they were struggling to hold the weight of the darkness inside. The thing in the attic screeched, an otherworldly, spine-chilling sound, as it writhed and twisted, fighting the fire that now surrounded it. Father Donnelly was beside me, his hands pressed together in prayer, his face twisted in concentration and fear. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, offering whatever strength he could through his faith. But the shadows were fighting back. The fire was hot, but it wasn't enough. The entity wasn't so easily destroyed. The flames began to dim, flickering weakly as the house groaned again, its foundation creaking under the strain of an ancient power that had lived here far too long. I could feel the force of the thing's anger, its need to survive, even as the fire weakened. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, followed by a deep rumble, as if something inside the house had been shattered. The flames roared back to life, and the entity's screams grew louder, more desperate. With a final, bone-chilling roar, the shadows collapsed in on themselves, consumed by the fire. The house trembled one last time, and then everything went silent. The flames licked the wooden beams and the rotting walls, consuming the last remnants of the malevolent force that had haunted this place for so long. As the fire spread outward, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The pressure, the suffocating presence was gone. But it wasn't enough. Father Donnelly collapsed to his knees, his hands shaking as he looked at the burning house, a grim expression on his face. He had done his best, but the price had been high. The fire continued to rage, but now the house was empty, its grip broken. The entity was gone, but it had cost us everything. I stumbled backward, my body weak from the strain, my mind reeling. The house was burning to the ground, but I felt a hollow emptiness inside. The battle was over, but the price of victory was too high. Father Donnelly didn't speak. He only looked at me, his eyes full of sorrow, as the flames consumed the house around us. Back around 1992, I was in high school. At that time I was a sophomore, and unlike most of my friends in school, I didn't work the typical high school jobs like McDonald's, Taco Bell, some retail job in the mall, or work at the local grocery store. I was very good with my hands and worked jobs like construction, demolition, flooring, and auto mechanics. All of my contacts I worked under the table as I started working on some of these jobs at 14. It was beneficial for both of us, as I was only called in when needed, and I was the guy willing to only work evenings and weekends. One of my contacts worked doing remodeling projects like at restaurants, bars, retail shops, and typical commercial projects that we could only work after hours. Like I said, that worked out for both of us because I went to school and would sometimes work after school or weekends. For this one contact, it wasn't uncommon for him to leave me alone at a site and have a list of things for me to do alone, mostly demolition work. I did this while the other crew was doing the installation or remodeling work. I was the kid, but had their respect because I did what I was supposed to do and did the work of a man without complaints. I got paid good, and in one night I could make more than my friends did working all week at McDonald's. This one instance, I got a call from the guy I worked for, and he said he had a project for me, and if I could work the following Saturday. I said yes, sure. He said be sure to bring food and lots to drink, as there was nothing nearby. I used to have a small cooler and would fill it with drinks like Cokes, Gatorade, or whatever, plus chips and a couple sandwiches. Back then I could eat a whole pizza by myself and burn it all off. He picked me up that Saturday morning, as I didn't have a car or license yet, so he would pick me up and drive me to sites for work and leave me alone there. I rarely worked with his other crews, as they were the more skilled labor guys. I was just the tear-out kid. Here is the part that was my major downfall to this story. I didn't pay attention to where we were going. I was too busy talking to him, and I think we were talking about cars. You see, at the time my goal was to save up enough money to buy an old muscle car and rebuild it. It took a long time to arrive to the site. As we drove up, it was in the middle of nowhere. Now you may not think California has places like this, but back in the early 1990s out in the Mojave Desert, yes, it was big plots of land and homes more than a few city blocks apart. I knew we left the highway and went down a few other two-lane highways for a long distance. I remember he asked me about my drinks, and he pulled out a brand new jug of water that he had in his truck that looked like it had been there a while, and told me to take it with me just in case. He said that the water to the house I would be working at was off. As we pull up to the property, he is a hurry to drop off tools and get to another work site, so I hurry up and help him with things like breaker bars, shovels, pry bar, hammer, brooms, several big trash bins, and a small tool bag that I often had with me. He tells me that he will be back to pick me up at about 5-6 p.m., as there is no electricity to this site either, plus it should only take me till then to do what I needed to do. That was always his way of saying, I am only paying you till this time, so you better get everything done by then. It was never too outrageous, and we always had a good understanding on time and tasks. He drove away, and I am at this property all alone. I walk into the house, it's mostly empty. My job was to remove all remaining furniture, contents, and appliances. Remove all the flooring, gut the kitchen and bathrooms, and remove all of the wood paneling. This project was going to be like what we now call a flip. They were going to fix it up and sell it. Almost immediately I get kind of spooked by the place. It was very odd. Now mind you, I am used to being on sites alone, working all night. This was the daytime on a Saturday and bright outside. However, the house was old, dark, musty, and kind of cool inside, the kind of cool that gives you goosebumps. To add to the spook factor of the house, let me describe what I remember about the house. Imagine walking back in time to the 1960s or earlier. Dark green carpet that looked like matted down broccoli, pine wood everywhere that had a darker stain to it. The wood paneling wasn't the kind used in the 1980s sheet paneling, but actual board paneling tonged and groove, old window curtains that all looked like someone's grandma made, avocado green sink, stovetop, oven, and the stuff that was left behind like old furniture, and a closet full of old stuffed animals that looked to be about 30 years old. The style of this house was like an old western ranch, as there were wagon wheels inside and outside the house. I had an old battery-powered radio, but only could get a few stations, but was just happy for the noise. I started removing all the junk from the house, and as I normally did on a project, if there wasn't a dumpster on site, I made a trash pile. I tore up all the flooring next. To my delight, everything seemed to come up with ease, and it was rip, cut, and toss. I took a big demo hammer to the kitchen and tore it apart in less than an hour. I ended up using that big jug of water that my boss had given me to wash my hands and face periodically, but by late noon, as most who know the desert, the dryness also starts to take moisture from you, especially if you are working in it. So by late afternoon, I am down to my last drink, and I had already ate everything I brought. No worries, I thought the guys should be here in a couple hours to pick me up. As the time gets closer for them to arrive, I am all done with my tasks. I even sweep the entire place, and it's now ready for the rehab crew to get to work making this place look modern. The time of year I was out here, it wasn't a typical hot desert day, but you know in the desert, as soon as the sun goes down, it starts to cool rapidly. I had a flannel shirt, but that wasn't enough, and it was starting to get dark. This was the time before cell phones were common, and well, there was no electricity, water, and phone service to the house. I climbed up to get on top of the roof of the house to get a better look to see if I can see something in the distance, and what looked like miles down, I saw a smaller road that this dirt road lead to and a few homes, but those homes were all in dark. My first thought was hike down to a neighbor's house and ask them to use the phone. The nearest house, no one was home, and this home also looked abandoned. If you remember, the early 90s was the start of a decline of the economy and recession, so it wasn't uncommon for a lot of foreclosed homes and a tract of homes. A lot of those I worked on at that time. I started to think about my options as darkness fast approached. One was to stay at the house until morning, to hike with what little water I had a few miles in the dark Mojave night. 3, wait until early morning and hike out of there to some sort of civilization. It also suddenly occurred to me that no one knew where I was except my boss. I don't know if he told anyone else where I was, and certainly my family wouldn't miss me until maybe Sunday night. But I didn't even tell them I was going to work there. They knew me and how much I would work to save up for my car that they never worried about me not coming home. As full darkness was all around me, it was amazing looking out at the night sky, and lucky for me the moon was bright. I didn't have a flashlight or any way to make a fire. Even though I tried, I was going to make a small bonfire out of broken up construction debris as the temperatures started to fall, probably down to the low 40s. My only option was to go back inside the empty creepy house that somehow seemed even more creepy sitting alone in the dark. At about 8 p.m., the batteries on my radio, which was my only source of little light and noise, started to die. I grabbed an old wooden chair and sit in the living room of this house facing the door. I am starting to hear wind, odd noises which I assume are animals in the distance, and what sounds like leaves cracking under feet. I am starting to shiver from the cold, so I set off on trying to start a fire in the fireplace. Imagine like Tom Hanks in Castaway trying to start a fire. At least this is keeping my mind of my situation. Sitting in this living room next to the fireplace, the house seems even more darker than it should have. Mind you, in the daytime, the inside seemed dark, so with only the moonlight, I was pretty much sitting in complete darkness. My mind starts to play tricks on me. I am seeing shadows moving outside and inside the house. I am also starting to hear someone talking like whispers or something. I get up from my chair and yell out hello, and just as I do, I hear something fall from the other side of the house. I run over to the door and go outside again. At least in the moonlight I can see better, but off in the distance I hear noises and see movement, but can't make it out. I have my pile of tools by the edge of the house ready for when my boss picks me up, so I run over there and grab Big Daddy. It was my heavy pry bar that I used in demo. I was ready to defend myself for who or what was out there. I have to keep moving because my undershirt and flannel shirt wasn't enough to keep me warm. The wind was also starting to pick up, and for as far as I could see, no lights around me. I didn't want to try to make it up on the house again out of fear of falling in the dark, but I get up on top of the gate just to try and gain a little bit of altitude to see if I see some house lights on nearby or car lights. My mind went to the stories that circled around at the time about how people would come up to Mojave Desert and bury bodies, how there were Satanist groups out here, and how people would go missing for no reason out here. Every noise had me on edge, and every shadow had my heart pounding. Now I knew no one was in that house, but I swear I would hear noises from inside. I huddled up on the front porch looking in the living room window, expecting to see someone at any moment. By around 11 p.m., I look at my watch thinking this is going to be a long night, as all this stuff only happened since it got dark. I don't know how I am going to make it another 6 hours till daybreak. I start thinking the moment it gets to be daybreak, like the moment light starts to appear on the horizon, I am going to take the little water I had left and walk east. I knew going east I would eventually make it somewhere. The dirt road I was off of, I knew that direction lead to a paved road. Closer to midnight, I am wide awake, my eyes are fixed on the dirt road, thinking that any time now a car would come down it, and maybe they can call for help for me. I remember casually turning to look back into the house, as all this time I keep hearing noises, but telling myself maybe a rat or some animal. I see a shadow of a person move from the kitchen to down the hall. I jump up from sitting down and was like, that is not an animal, that is a human. I start backing my way out of the porch towards the pile and trip over debris and fall down on the ground. I get up but fall again. It was like something pushed me down, or my imagination. But all of a sudden these bright lights are coming closer to me as I am laying on the ground. I jump up and it's my boss. He is looking at me like, what the heck are you doing? I was just so glad to see him. I wasn't mad or anything, just asked him what happened. He said that he was sorry, but he thought the other crew was coming to get me, and they thought that he was coming. So no one actually came. He said it wasn't until later in the evening. He asked the other crew leader about how far along I got, that he said I didn't go get him. Well, it took him almost 2 hours from where they were working to come get me. He felt really bad and told me he was going to pay me for the entire time I was out there. He also grabbed a can of Coke from his cooler and asked me if I was thirsty, and I drank that all in one gulp. Once we got back towards civilization, he went through a fast food drive-through, and I ate like I had never ate before. As he was driving me home, I asked him about the house. I told him how creepy it was. He said he didn't have any information on the house, only just what we were supposed to do. After that, I made sure to always keep extra batteries, flashlight, and double the amount of liquid. I wasn't used to the noise, the hum of a million lives in motion, yet it was strangely calming. This was my new home now. The apartment on the 17th floor wasn't much in the grand scheme of things. Modern, sleek, impersonal like most of the city's high-rise offerings. The walls were white, the floors polished concrete, and the windows, glass stretching from floor to ceiling, framed a view of Chicago that seemed endless, sprawling, unforgiving. It was perfect. A refuge from the unrelenting pace of the city, yet nestled within it. I didn't mind the anonymity of it. It was easy to disappear into a building where people lived in isolation despite being stacked one atop the other. And so I settled in, trying to ignore the buzz of disquiet in my stomach, that persistent itch of unease. After all, this was the life I wanted. My job as a freelance photojournalist kept me busy. Long nights of editing, arranging shots, chasing down stories that might never materialize. I loved it. The quiet solitude of my work was comforting, but the silence was often too much. The view outside my window, so breathtaking in its vastness, often became a thing I couldn't stop staring at. The city pulsed beneath me, a living organism that, for some reason, I found fascinating. People moved about, small and distant like ants. Insignificant in their motions, yet integral to the machine. It was one of these nights, as I sat hunched over my laptop, The glow of the screen, the only light in my apartment, that I saw him. Across the street, in the opposite building, someone stood at their window. A figure, shrouded in darkness, his eyes fixed on me. I tried to rationalize it at first. Just another late-night wanderer, perhaps. But there was something unnerving about the way he stood there, unmoving. I couldn't make out his features, but I knew, without a doubt, that he was watching me. I tried to dismiss it. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself. "People watch. It's a city. It happens." But that night, sleep didn't come easy. I couldn't shake the image of him, standing there in the window, like some shadow from a dream. The thought lingered, festering in the back of my mind. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this kind of unease. Living alone in a city like this, especially in a place like this, was bound to invite a sense of isolation. But this was something different, something more unsettling. The first photo came the next morning. I didn't think much of it when I found the envelope taped to my door. It wasn't unusual. People in the building had their quirks. It wasn't the first time I'd found an odd note or a package on my doorstep. The apartment building had a strange kind of rhythm to it, quiet, almost sterile. But this time I felt something stir deep in my chest, a tightening of my throat. I bent down to pick up the envelope and instinctively checked the hallway for anyone who might be watching. Nothing, of course. Inside the envelope, there was a single photograph, a close-up of me, sleeping. I could tell by the dim lighting that it had been taken from outside through the window. The photo was grainy, blurry at the edges, but it was undeniably me. The picture was a snapshot of my most vulnerable state, an intimate moment stolen without my knowledge. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I convinced myself that it was nothing. Just a prank, a sick joke. Maybe someone thought it was funny. Maybe I was being paranoid. But then the photos kept coming. The next day, another envelope, another photo. This one was taken from further down the hallway. It was a shot of me from the outside, standing in front of my window, my reflection in the glass catching the light. I was alone. There was no one else around. But the eerie thing was that, even though I was sure I hadn't been observed, there was no way for anyone to have seen me from that angle, unless they were watching. It was then that I realized the photos weren't just random. They weren't taken at a distance. They were intimate, detailed, capturing moments of my life that I hadn't even thought twice about. There were pictures of me on the balcony, pictures of me in the kitchen, even a few where I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, unknowingly the subject of someone's gaze. I didn't want to believe it, but I could feel the dread creeping up my spine, growing with each passing hour. Someone was watching me. Someone had been watching me for a while, and I had no idea who. I called the police, of course. I had to. But the officer on the other end of the line was dismissive. "It's probably just a misunderstanding," he said. "People do weird things. Maybe someone's trying to get a rise out of you. We'll send someone over to check, but there's not much we can do without proof." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him how serious this felt, how much it was eating at me, but I didn't. Instead, I hung up, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. There was nothing they could do. I was on my own. The photos kept coming like clockwork. Each day, another one appeared on my doorstep. At first, I tried to ignore them, convincing myself that it was a twisted joke. Something harmless, even though the images made my skin crawl. But as time passed, the photos grew more disturbing. No longer were they just shots of me in my most vulnerable moments. Now they seemed to capture my every move. The way I sat at my desk, working late into the night, the angle of my head as I stared out the window. The photos were more intimate than any I had ever seen of myself. I was no longer certain of when the photos were being taken. Some of them I recognized, like the ones from the bathroom mirror, taken while I brushed my teeth or splashed my face with cold water. Others I didn't remember at all. They were snapshots of me in my apartment at times I never thought anyone could be watching. The worst ones, though, were the ones taken at night when I stood silhouetted against the window, my outline barely visible against the city lights. The pictures were haunting, like glimpses of myself in some kind of fever dream. It was no longer just a case of someone taking a photo and moving on. It was a pattern, an obsession. The feeling of being watched intensified with each passing day. The photos weren't accidental. They were too deliberate, too specific. Whoever was taking them was studying me, watching me, waiting. I installed a motion-triggered camera in my apartment. It wasn't much, just a small, inconspicuous device, but I hoped it would catch whoever was lurking in the shadows. I needed to know who was behind this madness. I needed proof. The first night, the camera recorded something. I was still awake, staring at the screen of my laptop, editing photos. The notification pinged on my phone, pulling my attention to it. I opened the app, expecting to see nothing more than a motion alert, a cat wandering in the hallway or a shift in the shadows. But it wasn't that. A figure stood in the dark hallway, barely visible, his face shrouded in shadow. I froze, the image of the figure searing itself into my mind. I held my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears, as the figure lingered at the far end of the hallway. He wasn't outside. He was inside the building, just outside my door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as he slowly approached, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the carpeted hallway. I should have been terrified, but a cold numbness spread over me, numbing my body, my mind. I wasn't just being watched anymore. He was inside, and I was trapped. My phone buzzed again, this time with another image, the figure at my door. I could see his shadow move as he knelt down, and then, with a sickening realization, I saw him slip something under the door. My heart raced. What had he left for me this time? I didn't wait to find out. I rushed to the door, my hand trembling as I unlocked it. I opened it cautiously, peering down the hallway. Nothing. No one. But the feeling that something was terribly wrong lingered. It gnawed at me. The quiet, oppressive silence of the hallway pressed in around me, suffocating in its stillness. I shut the door quickly, my hands trembling as I locked it again, and I did what I could only do in that moment. I tried to breathe, to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense anymore. I couldn't keep pretending it wasn't happening. I had to know who was doing this to me. I wasn't going to wait for the police, not when I already knew they wouldn't take me seriously. What was I supposed to tell them? That someone had been stalking me from the shadows. That my apartment had become a prison, and I was its helpless occupant. No, I had to take matters into my own hands. I started by looking at the building's security footage. I'd never really paid much attention to it before, but now I was desperate. I was hunting for anything that could explain what was going on, any clue that might lead me to the person who was tormenting me. I scrolled through the footage for hours, searching for something that stood out. I had almost given up when I saw him. The footage from the lobby was grainy, but it was clear enough. There, in the corner of the frame, was the man. The one who had been watching me. He didn't look like anyone I recognized, and that only made my heart race faster. I zoomed in, hoping for a better look, and then I saw it. He had a key. The man who had been stalking me, taking photos of me, had access to the building. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. How could this be? Who was he? I continued watching the footage, my eyes scanning the lobby for any sign of him moving towards my apartment. And then I saw it. The figure entered the elevator, heading straight for the 17th floor. He had a key. He could come into my apartment at any time. I watched, paralyzed, as he reached my floor. He was moving toward my door. I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't see the camera, hoping he wouldn't notice that I had been watching him too. The footage didn't show what happened next. I had to check the footage from my own apartment building's camera. The man entered the hallway. He didn't knock. He didn't ring the doorbell. He simply stopped in front of my door and stood there for a moment, staring. I couldn't breathe. Was he waiting for me to open the door? Was this it? Was he going to come inside? The seconds felt like hours. But then he bent down, reaching under my door, and slipped something inside. I could barely make out what it was, but my heart stopped when I recognized the small, familiar object. A photo. Another photo. My stomach churned. He had been inside. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't crazy. I stared at the footage in horror. The man wasn't a stranger. He was someone I knew. Someone who lived in this building. Someone I had spoken to even. He was my upstairs neighbor. His name was Victor Stone. I remembered now. He had been a successful fashion photographer before his career fell apart, the rumors about his obsession with beauty swirling in whispers. And now I was his next subject. I couldn't stop shaking. I knew his name now, but it didn't make me feel safe. I felt like I was drowning. He had been watching me, preparing for something I couldn't even begin to understand. I had no idea how deep his obsession ran, but I had a feeling that it was far worse than I could ever imagine. I needed to do something. But what? What could I possibly do to stop him now? I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I couldn't let him come for me again. The fear had turned into something else now. Something sharp, something that gnawed at my insides, pushing me into a corner where I had no choice but to act. I wasn't going to be his next victim. I was going to take control. The plan formed quickly, almost out of desperation. I would turn his game against him. I knew he thrived in the dark, in the hidden corners of my apartment, where his cameras could watch me without my knowledge. But I was going to expose him. I was going to make him a target, the way he had made me. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about making him feel what I had felt, the helplessness, the fear. I spent the entire night preparing. My apartment, which had once been a sanctuary, became a maze of motion sensors and cameras. I set up every corner, every nook, with an eye on the doorway, the windows, the places where he had been before. I made sure I would know the instant he crossed the threshold. The lights, bright, blinding flashes, were rigged to trigger the moment someone entered. I wasn't going to let him slip by unnoticed. I was going to expose him for the monster he was. It took everything I had to keep my composure as I waited. My nerves were stretched tight. The hours crawled by, and every sound in the building made me jump. The creak of a door, the hum of the elevator, the footsteps in the hallway. I kept thinking, this is it. This is when he'll try to come in. And then I heard it. The familiar sound of the floorboards creaking under heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like he knew exactly what he was doing. He was coming for me. I felt my pulse race, my breath quicken, but I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I knew he was outside the door. He was close, so close. I triggered the lights. The flashes went off all at once, blinding white light exploding throughout the apartment. I heard him curse under his breath, the sound of his boots scraping against the floor as he stumbled back, temporarily disoriented by the sudden burst of brightness. But it was enough. The cameras had caught him. I had the proof I needed. He fumbled for a moment, trying to recover, but I could hear him coming toward me again. He had a knife in his hand, I realized. The sound of it scraping against the floor was like a death knell. I backed away from the door, trying to gather my bearings. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up. But then, something went wrong. In the chaos of it all, the door swung open just a little wider than I had planned. I saw his silhouette, a shadow in the doorway, knife raised. I didn't hesitate. I triggered the lights again, and this time I didn't hold back. The lights flickered, flashing bright enough to blind him completely. He staggered back, his knife falling to the floor with a loud clatter. But he was disoriented, off balance. He tried to recover, but the moment he moved forward, he lost his footing. Victor stumbled backward, crashing into the glass of the balcony door. I watched, frozen in horror, as he went through it, the glass shattering around him. It happened so quickly. One moment he was standing in front of me, the next, he was gone. The sound of his fall was deafening, the thud of his body hitting the ground far below. I could barely comprehend what had just happened. The apartment was silent once more. The adrenaline in my veins began to wear off, and the weight of what I had just done hit me all at once. I staggered back from the door, my body trembling. I had to know. I had to see if he was still alive. I ran to the balcony, my legs shaking beneath me, and looked down. Victor Stone lay broken on the pavement below, the knife still clutched in his hand. There was no movement. He was gone. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I had just killed him. The police arrived shortly afterward. I didn't tell them everything. I couldn't. What could I say? That I had trapped him, exposed him, and watched as he fell to his death. They didn't need to know everything. All they needed to know was that I was safe. But when they searched his apartment, they found the truth. A room hidden away from the rest of the apartment, filled with photos. Hundreds of photos of me, of women I didn't recognize. Pictures of them sleeping, smiling in terror, their faces contorted in fear. Some of the women had even gone missing. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't the first. I wasn't the only one. Victor Stone had been stalking women for years. And now I had been his final, most twisted subject. The horror was over. I often stay up late to clean. It's just who I am. Being a night owl, the quiet of the house, the stillness of the world outside, makes it so much easier to focus and get things done without distractions. My family's sound asleep by then, and I have the whole place to myself. My routine is simple, almost meditative. I clean, I straighten things up, and I lose track of time in the process. But there's one night, one that I'll never forget, when time stopped feeling like it was my own. It was just past 3 a.m. I was in the living room, fiddling with the side table by the mirror, adjusting a picture frame that had been slightly askew. I must have been so wrapped up in my task because I didn't notice at first. But when I looked up, my reflection was there, and it was smiling at me. I know what you're thinking. You must have been tired, or maybe you just thought you saw something. But let me tell you, it wasn't that. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't even thinking about smiling. And yet, there it was, my reflection grinning back at me. It wasn't a happy, goofy smile either. No, it was cold, angry. I could feel the malice coming off of it, like it was sneering at me. It made my skin crawl. My blood turned to ice, and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I blinked hard, my eyes stinging, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But when I opened them again, the smile was gone. My reflection was just like it had been before. Neutral, calm. No grin, no trace of that dark energy. But the feeling, that lingered. I felt it in my gut, a knot of dread that wouldn't loosen. I don't know how long I stood there after, staring at my own reflection, heart pounding in my chest. But I snapped out of it eventually. I hurried to finish up my cleaning and got into bed, a little faster than usual. I've made it a habit since then to be in bed before 3 a.m. I can't bring myself to stay up past that hour anymore. But that smile wasn't the only thing I've dealt with. No, that's just the beginning. This thing, whatever it is, has been following me for as long as I can remember. It started when I was a little girl, haunting my dreams. At first, I didn't even realize it was the same thing. But I was wrong. It's been there, lurking in the shadows of my sleep, disguising itself in different ways. I remember the first time it showed itself clearly. It appeared to me as a painting. One of the Virgin Mary from my church, the same one that had hung on the wall for years. Only this time, the Virgin was smiling. But it wasn't a peaceful, loving smile. It was that same smile. That sinister, evil grin that I'd seen in my mirror. And in that moment, I knew something was wrong. I've had that same feeling in my dreams ever since. The thing always comes back, disguised as someone I should trust. Someone kind, someone friendly. But I know better now. Every time it appears, I feel the same overwhelming sense of unease, like a warning deep in my gut. Something's off, something's not right. It tries to convince me to trust it. I can't remember exactly what it says. It's like the words slip through my mind as soon as I wake up. But the feeling stays, and I pray. I pray harder than I've ever prayed before, asking God for protection, begging for the strength to wake up, to escape it. The strange occurrences don't stop with the dreams. There was the time my old cat freaked out, staring into the corner of my room and clawing at the air. She was terrified, her fur bristling, her eyes wide. I tried to calm her down, but she just kept trying to get away from the corner. I brought her back into the room later, just to see if it happened again. It did. She reacted the same way. Fur on end, claws digging into the floor. But when I looked, I saw nothing. Just an empty corner. It's happened a few times now, that feeling of something being there when I can't see it. The feeling that something's watching me. That same presence. I pray to God, asking for guidance, hoping for the strength to face whatever it is. If you've ever felt something like this. Something that follows you, that watches you from the corners of your vision, that tries to make you trust it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm not sure what I'm dealing with here, but I know I'm not the only one. And the more I try to ignore it, the stronger it gets. It's only a matter of time before it shows up again. It was just after 1:30 a.m. when I got home from my boyfriend's house, the night air cool and still. I parked my car down the road because, well, there's never any room in the driveway. As I walked up the path toward the front door of my house, something made me stop. A short, quick whistle. 1 or 2 notes, sharp and clear, like someone was trying to get my attention. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced around. The street was silent. There was no one in sight, no movement, nothing. I live on a small dead-end street, and after 10 years, I know everyone here. I could rule out my neighbors, no question. They'd never do something like this. I kept walking, a little more on edge now, and when I reached the top step of the landing, I heard it again. That same quick whistle. This time, it felt like it was coming from behind me closer. I turned around, scanning the darkness, but again there was nothing. My pulse was pounding in my ears now, my body on high alert. I turned back to the door, fumbling for my keys, and as I slid one into the lock, I heard it again, closer. So much closer, like it was just a few feet behind me. I've never opened a door faster in my life. Once inside, I checked the windows, peeking through the blinds to see if I could spot anyone lurking outside. But the street was quiet, still, as it should be at that hour. No one. The next day, over dinner, I shared the whole ordeal with my family and boyfriend. Of course, they all laughed it off. "It's just that bird," they said, "the noisy one." There is a bird in our neighborhood that's been around for months now, screeching in its high-pitched, almost mechanical tune at all hours of the day and night. But that bird doesn't whistle like a person. It makes a drawn-out, almost eerie song, but it's not the quick, sharp whistle I'd heard. I know the difference. I've heard that bird's tune every day for months now, and what I heard the other night. Not a bird. Fast forward to this morning. My mum messaged me, saying my sister heard whistling last night. At 4 a.m., no less. She'd heard the same thing I had. A person's whistle, clear as day, like a song, but not quite a song. My sister had thought someone was in the house at first. It was that distinct. But she was too scared to scream. I thought I'd be the only one to hear it, but now my sister. It was starting to feel off. It couldn't be just a coincidence, could it? But maybe it was a new bird that had moved into the area. Maybe I was overthinking it. Still, it was unsettling, especially since no one in my family had ever mentioned anything like this happening before. And then to have it happen twice within the span of a week. I don't know, it felt wrong. Then, last night, it happened again. I was asleep when I was jolted awake by the same song-like whistle that my sister had heard, loud and clear, right outside my window. It was 3:30 a.m. I sat up, frozen, listening. It wasn't just a random whistle. It was a tune, a soft melody, eerie and clear enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to listen, hoping it was something familiar, but no, it was nothing I recognized. It was creepy. Almost deliberate. It didn't sound like it was inside, but it was close. Very close, right outside my house, near the side where my bedroom window is. I told my mum right away. Now she was freaked out too. "What if someone's lurking around the house?" she said, her voice tight with fear. "What if it's not just a bird?" I could tell she was starting to panic a little. Then, of course, my dad. Big, strong, "Nothing scares me, Dad," shrugged it off. "It's probably the neighbors or another bird. Relax." He was calm as always, telling us not to worry. But how could I not? Two of us had heard it now. I know what I heard, and it wasn't some bird or animal. It was whistling. A clear, human-like whistle that echoed through the night air. Now I'm starting to wonder if it's someone. Someone hiding in the shadows watching. My mind keeps racing, and every little sound outside makes me jump. I keep telling myself to calm down, but can I be scared? Should I be? I'm not going back to that cabin. I'll be the first to say that all this stuff could have taken place in my head. The mind is a freaky thing and can play some pretty trippy tricks on you. Sorry for the length. Whenever I was scared as a kid, my dad had always told me that in life, you should not be scared of ghosts. Fear the living because they can actually hurt you. In my late teenage years, I came into some money after my father committed act of unaliving himself, and I received an inheritance from him. At the time of my dad's passing, he and my mom owned a cabin up in Oregon by Mount Bachelor. The cabin had been put up for sale since my mom could no longer afford the payments, and renting it out was not covering the payments either. The cabin was set to go on the market for sale in less than a month, and was in the process of finalizing all the paperwork with the realtor and lawyer. So for that month's time, the cabin was not going to be rented out any longer and was going to be vacant. I saw this as a chance to get away for a while and clear my head in light of all the things going on. I quit work, packed up my snowboarding gear, grabbed my dog, and headed up in my dad's car that he had willed to me to the cabin. Now, this was our family cabin that my parents rented out throughout the year when we were not using it. I had keys to the cabin and also had the code for the alarms, so I did not feel the need to stop at the rental management company and advise them of my stay. This has nothing to do with the coming story, but felt the need to mention it anyway. My first 2 days at the cabin were normal, and nothing out of the unusual happened. Spent my days playing with my dog in the snow, snowboarding, and the evenings playing PlayStation or listening to music, drinking and smoking out on the balcony. Had already stocked up on food, cigarettes, and liquor, so I was pretty much a shut-in aside from the occasional out to hit the slopes. With my dog as company and DVDs and PlayStation as entertainment, I was quite content and started to feel relaxed after all the drama that had preceded my outing. The cabin itself was 2 stories. The bottom story had the living room and a side guest bedroom along with a small kitchen. Upstairs had another 2 rooms along with a walkout balcony attached to the master bedroom. Most of my time there was spent either in the living room, kitchen, or master bedroom. I never ventured into the other rooms and always kept the doors leading into them shut. Open doors to dark rooms always creeped me out. Anyhow, the 3rd day came around and I was going through my usual routine of playing with my dog. His name was Midnight, by the way, and he also since passed playing games and watching DVDs. That day it was pretty heavy snowfall, so I did not feel like trekking down the hill to the main road in my car and decided to stay in. That's when things started getting a bit weird. In our area, there were only 2 other cabins adjacent to ours, maybe a block away from each other. All other cabins aside from these 2 were around a mile away from ours. Surrounding us was mostly forest and very tall pine trees, tall 9-1. This is important later on. Both these cabins were empty, and from the past couple of days, I knew that no one was currently staying there. Gave enough background and am going to jump to the weirdness. Around midday, while outside with my dog, I noticed what looked like footprints in the snow around the area surrounding our cabin. It was still snowing, so the footprints looked semi-fresh, like someone had been there in the last 20-30 minutes before me. I thought that maybe someone was staying in the cabin near me that I may not have noticed. Maybe they were shut-ins like me. Alright, whatever, the footprints lead away from my cabin, and they disappeared in the snow towards the denser part of the trees. Disregarded the footprints and went back inside. Nighttime came around and decided to head to bed. My dog Midnight was laying on the bed with me when I noticed his ears perk up to a standstill and listening position. This was followed by him quickly jumping off the bed and running downstairs to the living room. I lay in bed and stayed silent. I was kind of freaked out and could hear him moving around downstairs back and forth. After around 5 minutes, he ran back upstairs to me and started to do his doggy dance for the sign that he had to pee or that he wanted to go outside. Shit. Well, fine. I can't say no to him, so we both went downstairs to the outside driveway for him to his thing. Only, he didn't want to pee. As soon as we were outside, he started to pull on his leash, trying to drag me to where he wanted to go. He kept looking into the dense part of the trees where the prints had been earlier. But he also kept sniffing the side of the house and looking up towards the roof. After he figured out that I was not going to go to where he wanted, he sat himself down and just stared into the darkness. A bit unusual for him, but alright, maybe there are forest animals out there that he wants to chase down. But F this, I didn't want to chance anything, so I pulled him back inside, and we both headed back upstairs. Around half an hour later, I was lying in bed when I heard what sounded like hooves walking on my roof. It was only a series of around 6 steps, and I rationalized that it could be a pine cone falling from a tree onto the roof, or maybe a kind-hearted forest animal running around. But here's the thing, the steps seemed to be spaced apart like a man-length stride, so it was really freaking me out. Midnight also heard the noise and was quick to run to the balcony screen door, expecting for me to let him out. Alright, you know what, I'm a tough guy and at the time considered myself to be fairly well built and strong enough to handle myself. So I grabbed my coat and shoes along with my cigarettes and flashlight and went out onto the balcony. F it right. As soon as I was outside, I lit up my cigarette and started canvassing the roof with my light. Nothing there, and the snow on top was undisturbed. Weird, must have been all my head. What about Midnight hearing the noise? Maybe he was feeding off my fear or paranoia. I started to calm down and relax again. By the way, I am shaking right now and my heart is beating hard as I am typing this next bit. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness, and I kept smoking and just staring at the stars and trees next to our cabin. That's when I saw it. In a tree that was a little taller than our cabin and around 20 feet from the balcony, I saw what looked like a man crouched in a squatting position in between two branches. It looked really tall, like 8 or 9 foot, and it was really skinny. It was squatted on one branch, and its freakishly long, white arms were extended above its head, holding onto the branch above it, while its mouth was wide open with no expression. F me. What the F is that? I wasn't sure if I was really seeing this thing and stood just staring and sat there motionless. I noticed Midnight stand up and start pacing behind me and lightly barking at the same time. The thing still did not move. I put my cigarette out and was debating on shining the light in the thing's direction, but something in my head kept screaming not to. So I walked backwards to the inside of the room and pulled Midnight with me. Once inside, I locked the door and shined the light in the thing's direction, but there was nothing there. I shut the curtains to the screen door and retreated back to bed. But later on in the night, I heard some light tapping at the screen door, like someone was tapping on the glass with their fingers. It was consistent and did not stop for nearly an hour. Midnight seemed to stare at the door, but he wouldn't go near it anymore. The weirdest part was that I had a feeling like someone was inviting me to open the door. But at the same time, I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head telling me to stay in bed and not do it. I listened to my dad's voice and just stayed where I was. I passed out eventually and woke up in the morning. It didn't take me long to pack everything and get the hell out of there. The noises started about a week ago. I used to think it was just an animal, but now I'm getting a bit more concerned. For some backup information, I live alone out in the countryside in Mississippi, where I have an average-sized, cozy cabin that I stay in during the winter when I want to get away from the city. My nearest neighbor, Bill, lives 2 miles away from my cabin, leaving lots of untouched land in my favor. I am a stay-at-home book editor, so I don't usually need to leave my cabin unless it's to get groceries or occasionally visit friends and family. I live a rather quiet life out here, and I have limited human contact other than through my work laptop and my phone, although the Wi-Fi out here is rather spotty and a bit hard to use. Ever since a week ago, I have been having trouble sleeping. My bedroom is the largest room in the cabin and the comfiest. The walls are made of dark brown creaky oak wood, and the floor is composed of worn-down carpet. My desk sits right by a huge window that overlooks the forest and gives me a pretty good view of the front of my house. My bed is placed right beside my desk, and a small bathroom and closet face opposite to it. Usually, I would keep the curtains open when I went to bed because I enjoyed the feeling of waking up with the sun shining on me and the birds chirping. Now I am more hesitant about doing that. The night it started, everything was seemingly normal. I had just finished reading over a client's manuscript at about 12:30 a.m. and was shutting my laptop. I stood up, stretching as I had been sitting there for hours on end. I walked over to my nightstand by my bed and placed my phone down and began to head towards the bathroom. It was a small room, barely enough to fit 4 people. And my hygienic items were all cluttered messily on the bathroom counter beside my sink. Just as I had been reaching for my toothbrush, a small thump echoed throughout my cabin. Raising an eyebrow, I looked around. The following seconds consisted of silence, excluding the soft rumble of wind on the cabin windows. I shrugged, putting it off and deciding it must have been the old bedroom walls, as I was used to a lot of random noises coming from them. I turned on the sink to wash my toothbrush, frowning at the murky tap water. The man I bought the cabin from had repeatedly insisted that the water was safe to drink. It just looked odd, and that was what all water looked like out here. It still had been quite hard to get used to, as I had always been a bit of a germaphobe. Oddly enough, when I first bought the cabin, the man had also handed me survival gear and a motion-sensing camera claiming that it was just in case, which had weirded me out quite a lot when I came here for the first time, although I never really thought about it. When I finished brushing my teeth and washing my face, I turned out the bathroom light and headed back towards my bed. The bedroom light had already been turned off, so the only source of light was from the bright white crescent moon that was peeking out at me from behind the pine trees. Slipping into bed and pulling my blanket over me, it didn't take long for me to drift to sleep. A few hours later, I awoke suddenly to that same thumping noise. I wiped my eyes groggily and rolled over to face my nightstand. Still half asleep, I turned on my phone to check what time it was. The bright light illuminated my room and shined directly into my eyes, making them water. Thump. The noise began again. I hadn't even realized it had stopped. It was a quite odd pattern. Every now and then the sound would begin for a few seconds, and then stop for a minute or two. I made out the time on my phone to be 2:47 a.m. I sat up in bed, placing my phone back down. I looked sideways to glance out of the window, and was greeted by almost pitch darkness. I could just barely make out the tall figures of the trees. As the thumping noise came to a halt again, I came to the conclusion that it was probably some animal rummaging around the sides of my house. There have been a lot of black bear problems out here since campers have been feeding them and making them more hostile, and we also do have quite a bit of raccoons and deer. Hoping it wasn't a bear, I rolled back over and placed my pillow on top of my head in an attempt to block out the noise. I believe a few minutes passed again before the sound began again. Yet, this time it seemed to be much louder, or closer. I sighed and tried to dismiss the noise, annoyed. As the thumping noise continued, it seemed to break off from its previous pattern. It would pause for a few seconds and then start again instead of waiting a few minutes. I tried to ignore the sound, wanting to sleep. As a few more minutes went by, the sound quieted down, and I ended up falling into a restless sleep. That was the first time the noises started. Ever since then, the same thing has happened every single night. I will wake up near 2:30 a.m., and the noises will get louder and louder until they stop completely. Last night, when I woke up to the noises, I began to get a little nervous. Instead of a thumping noise, it had been tapping on the window. Whatever it was must have been looking in at me. Chills crawled down my spine as I imagined a bear by the window, trying to get in. I had woken up that next morning with a terrible headache, which I assumed was from my now constant lack of sleep. Late in the afternoon, I had been planning on how to get rid of the noise. I had decided to close the curtains and leave my porch light on. Determined to figure out the source of the sound, I rummaged through the package the cabin's former owner had given me and fished out the motion-sensing camera. I laughed to myself, finding it quite amusing that I had found a use for it after all. I made my way to my front door and headed towards my bedroom window. I hoisted the camera up and attached it to the bottom of the cabin roof and made it so that I had a perfect view of my window and most of my front yard. I headed back into my room and grabbed my phone so I could set it up there so when there was motion I would be alerted. I smiled to myself, glad I had found a way to figure out what had been making the noise. For the rest of the day, I worked at my desk with great ease, feeling like a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Soon, the sun began to set and the sky was painted beautifully with red, orange, and yellow. I made myself a cup of hot tea and sat down in my living room with a book in order to pass the time. I finally felt at peace knowing that I would figure out what this sound is soon, and I would stop it and go back to my normal cabin life. The comforting sound of birds singing faded slowly after about 30 minutes of reading, and I sat up, bookmarking my page and placing it back on the dresser it sat on. I made sure I left the porch light on and headed towards my bedroom where I got ready for bed, and then made my way under my blankets, double-checking that my curtains were closed before I went to sleep. Ding. I was suddenly shaken awake by a loud notification from my phone. I sat up quickly, reaching for my phone wearily. My eyes adjusted to the sudden bright light after a few seconds, and the time, of course, read 2:28 a.m. And I had one unread notification from the motion camera app I had downloaded earlier before. I hesitantly entered my phone passcode and then began to open the app. As it opened, a faint thumping noise began once again. When the app did open, I hurriedly opened the camera, desperate to see what the reason behind my suffering was. I didn't have much of a reaction at first. Thanks to the porch light, I could make out a figure huddled near the bottom of the cabin, making weird back and forth motions which caused the thumping noise, its small frame resembling a somewhat distorted raccoon. I chuckled quietly. I found it comical that this entire time it had been a mere raccoon tapping on my window, though I regretted that in an instant. The thing I thought was a raccoon suddenly shot up at what I believed to be my laugh. It definitely wasn't a raccoon. I gasped and my hand shot to my mouth. A large human-like figure stood by the window. Its entire body looked to be stretched, and I could make out the outlines of its bones just by looking closely. Its bones looked to be cramped inside its build, almost as if they were screaming to get out of it. It had matted long hair falling from the back of its head, and it was staring intently at my window. My entire body was trembling as it reached up one of what I think were its hands and started tapping. Tap, tap, tap. I let out a screech and glued my eyes to the camera. I felt as if I looked away for a split second, it would get away. Its eyes suddenly darted towards the camera, and I stifled a sob of terror when I saw its face. It looked human-like, though its eyes were terribly small and looked like black beads. Its arms looked like they were backwards, and every movement it made seemed painful or forced. I couldn't really make it out. Its lips were twisted in an awful, gut-wrenching smile that seemed to go from one side of its face to the other. It just smiled at me, and smiled. Its expression didn't change, though whatever it was seemed to be twitching. I didn't know what to do. I was completely frozen in place, and my heart hammered in my throat. I was convinced whatever the thing was outside of my window could hear my heartbeat. It was so loud. The silence was deafening as it seemed to be staring back at me through the camera. My hands were cold and clammy as I finally let the camera go, trying to calm myself down and deciding that this can't be real. Almost as soon as I looked away from the camera, the tapping began again. I was sick with fear and tired of just sitting there. "Leave," I shouted as loud as I could, raw panic filling my voice. I was met with silence, and I quickly grabbed the camera once again and checked, holding my breath. It was staring intently at the camera still, though its expression looked sad. What I thought were its eyebrows were furrowed down against each other, and its grin had turned into a very long frown. Fear throbbed inside me. Again, I shouted at it. Its head lashed to face the window instead of the camera. It shriveled backwards and began to stand on all fours. A strange hissing sound came from my window. It hastily slid off into the forest, its limbs bending and crumpling out of shape in a way that made me feel sick. I could see its head bobbing as it gained more distance, and eventually it disappeared from sight. My heart was still pounding, and I was sweating like crazy, and I checked the time once again. 3:58 a.m. The time had gone by so quickly, and I hadn't even realized. I sighed in relief, knowing it wasn't near my window anymore. Carefully, I slid out of bed and turned my lights on, knowing I wasn't going to sleep again. I opened my laptop and began typing this on an empty sheet because writing about traumatic events had always helped me calm down in the past. But no matter how much I wrote on here, I still felt terrible, like I'd never recover. I've been writing this for about an hour now, and the sun is going to come up pretty soon, but it is still very dark out. I really do hope the sun rises soon, though. I haven't checked the camera once since I saw that thing, and now I'm regretting that decision. Because now I hear something trying to open my front door, and I just remembered I left it unlocked. Point Paradise is probably my favorite place in the world, or at least it used to be. For those not familiar, it's a small, exclusive coastal community about an hour north of San Francisco. Over 100 miles of hiking trails twist through the community, from the redwoods all the way to the sandy beaches of the Pacific Ocean. It's not uncommon to spot bobcats and badgers on the trails, red-shouldered hawks and barn owls in the trees, and elephant seals on the beach. It's a dream for a nature lover like me. I worked as the on-site concierge for a property management service in Point Paradise. The title sounds fancy, but my job was not glamorous. I performed what my boss called gray zone tasks. Basically, if it didn't require a licensed professional like a plumber or an electrician, I was your gal. I checked mouse traps, patched up leaks, and plucked mushrooms out of the corners of humid bathrooms. I was also on call for any and all issues our visiting guests might experience. That mostly consisted of resetting Wi-Fi routers and helping old people operate the smart TVs. Summer flew by, and fall was busy with Halloween and Thanksgiving. But after the holidays, everything slowed down for the winter and the vacation cabins sat vacant. I enjoyed the slower pace after such a hectic first 6 months on the job. I had more time to sit in the coffee shop and work on my poems. But soon my boss took notice and started assigning me new tasks. On the day it happened, she asked me to inspect the 4 cabins up on Panoramic Hill and take notes on what needed to be fixed. I started with the cabin at the very top of the hill, with the best view of the ocean. That cabin is called Wildwood, a name chosen by the man who built it in the early 1900s. He was a banker in San Francisco, and the cabin was an engagement gift for his fiancée. The couple planned to use the place as a summer retreat, but the woman disappeared before the cabin was finished, and the grief-stricken banker spent all his money trying to find her, to no avail. I got all this background on the cabin from Greg, the town handyman, who offered me a ride up the hill in his truck. As we ascended the hill up to Wildwood, I told Greg about how, in the fall, I'd found 13 banana slugs oozing along the kitchen floor in that cabin. I'd never seen banana slugs work their way into a cabin before that, let alone 13 of them. It's because it's so high up, Greg told me, as his truck coughed out exhaust. The woods up here were never meant to be developed. It's kind of messed up if you think about it. All these redwood cabins in the redwood forest. Greg had lived here his whole life, almost 80 years, and was passionate about conservation. What's messed up about that? I asked. The cabins are so cute and cozy. We chopped down these ancient, towering trees, living things, mind you, and made little vacation cottages out of their corpses. Trees can't be corpses, I said. Why not? We kill them when we chop them down. They're dead. But they're not bodies. Corpses are dead bodies. We were nearing the top of the hill now, deep in the redwoods. Greg turned onto the gravel road that led to Wildwood. The ocean is a body of water, he said. One day the ocean will be one giant corpse. What do you care? I asked him. He caught the implication. Because I'll be dead by then. I didn't mean that, I explained. All I mean is we should enjoy what we have. I gestured towards the panoramic view of the ocean. I mean, look at it here. A hawk swooped down and caught a gopher in its talons. It's breathtaking, Greg said. I'll give you that. But everything comes with a price. I knew Greg wanted me to ask him what he meant, but to be honest, I didn't want to hear another one of his out-there theories about how the forest would correct the imbalance. I'd listened to enough of his ramblings in my 6 months at Point Paradise. My opinion, all the paint fumes he'd inhaled on the job made him a little unhinged. I opened the truck door and hopped out. Thanks for the ride. Stay vigilant, he said. January is always when the cracks open back up. He threw the truck in reverse and backed down the long driveway slowly, shrinking out of view. Inside the cabin, I worked through my regular routine. I ran the faucets, flushed the toilet, checked the ceiling for leaks, swept away any termite dust, emptied and rebaited rodent traps. Tamari almonds worked surprisingly well. Then I did a more thorough inspection of the house, looking for little things that might be off. I took note of a few burnt-out light bulbs, dead batteries in the stereo remote, some weather stripping that needed to be replaced. The biggest issue was the fuzzy black mold that had started growing along the baseboards in the bathroom. I kneeled down to inspect it, covering my nose and mouth with my shirt, and noticed in the corner a small hole in the drywall. It was barely noticeable, the hole, about the size of a quarter. Probably the work of an industrious mouse. They can squeeze into the space as small as a dime, Greg told me. Next time I was up here, I could patch it up with some spackle, or Greg could. He was always patching up holes. I shined my phone flashlight on the hole to inspect the damage and spotted something inside. I reached in with 2 fingers and pulled out a smooth, cool object. In my palm lay a small bone. Bones make me think of skeletons of death. But most of all, a clean, white bone like the one I held in my palm made me think of what was missing. Tissue, ligaments, blood. Where had those gone? Who had taken them? A clattering inside the walls. I paused, waiting to hear more. When I didn't, I snapped a picture of the bone and sent it to Greg, who moonlights as an animal tracker. "Any idea whose this is?" I asked. He replied right away. "Where'd you find that?" "Wildwood," I messaged back. "You know, where you literally just dropped me off." My guess was the bone belonged to a rat, because it seemed too big to belong to a mouse, and I couldn't imagine what else would be trapped inside the walls. "That's definitely a metacarpal," Greg texted back. "Human. How would a human bone get inside a wall?" No way it was a person's. Greg had to be messing with me. Still, my mind spiraled, coming up with explanations. Maybe it belonged to a builder, I thought. One of the men who sawed the redwood 2x4s that made up this cabin's walls. He was a big, burly man in my mind, with a thick blonde beard, piercing green eyes. There he was, just outside the cabin, tapping his 4 fingers on the bathroom window. I hated my mind for doing this. Why did it always let me down when I was trying to come up with new poems in the coffee shop, but then shifted into overdrive in this moldy bathroom in the middle of the woods? I thought about what Greg said, how the cabin is a corpse we live inside, and decided to get the hell out of there. But what was I supposed to do with the bone? I couldn't leave it there, next to the bathroom sink. My boss would kill me if a guest stumbled across it, and it seemed disrespectful to hide it or discard it or stuff it back into the hole, so I slipped the little finger bone into my back pocket and fled. I had never noticed holes in the cabin walls before. Sure, we'd set mouse traps, but only to catch mice on a mission to raid the pantry or eat the fresh fruit we set out for guests. We never had issues with rodents taking up residence in the walls, and yet, on my inspection of the second cabin, I found another small opening. I'd leave this hole alone, I told myself. No need to find out what was inside. I noted it on my inspection sheet so that Greg could patch it up tomorrow. I continued on, moving through the large cabin. But each time I passed through the kitchen, I caught myself glancing over at the hole. I was strangely drawn to it. Before I left the second cabin, I stepped closer to the hole to note its approximate size in my list of repairs. Big enough to fit a tennis ball, I determined, and jotted down the note. It was only when I looked back up from my clipboard that I saw it there, the pocket knife. It lay at the entrance of the hole. How had I not noticed it before? I picked up the knife and turned it in my hands, noting its smooth ivory handle. I slipped it into my back pocket with the bone. In the third cabin, I found no hole. But as I went to leave, I noticed the coat closet was slightly ajar. I slid the door shut, and several trekking poles clattered to the ground. I opened the door, gathered the poles, and reached up to place them back on the shelf. Just as I let go of the poles, something crawled across my hand and tugged at my fingers. I shrieked and yanked my hand away. Then slammed the closet door and rushed out of the cabin. Outside, I closed my eyes and took a few deep breaths. It was nothing, I told myself. Probably only a mouse. When I swept my hair out of my eyes, the light caught something on my finger. A gold band studded with small diamonds. It was too tight to slip it off. In the fourth cabin, there was an incessant knock on the floor. I traced it to the couch. When I slid the couch away, I saw the hole. A vacant eye watching me, and I wanted to look back. I kneeled down next to the hole. "Who's there?" I called out and pressed my ear against the wall. Only rodents squeaked back. I found a trap in the kitchen, baited it, and placed it just outside the hole. The hand emerged and snapped. It shook wildly, trying to free itself from the trap. Hold on, I said, regretting what I'd done. I freed the hand from the trap. Once the trap was removed, for reasons I cannot explain, I continued to hold the hand. Its skin was taut, smooth and soft, delicate even. A young woman's hand, identical to my own, aside from the missing finger. I massaged the hand gently, trying to tell it I was sorry for setting the trap, and just when I'd relaxed, the hand clutched my wrist. I twisted away and ran out of the cabin, all the way down the hill and back into town. The sun was setting when I arrived at my Prius, which was parked outside the property management office. The pocket knife was digging into my hip, so I tossed it on the passenger seat with my inspection notes and went inside the coffee shop next door for a vanilla latte. The barista had already started to mop the floors, but it was still 15 minutes before closing. I sat down at a corner table near the window with my journal and, to clear my head, tried to write a poem. But I was distracted when the sheriff waltzed by and took an interest in what was in my car. I went outside to talk to him. He leaned against the car. "I haven't seen a knife like that in a while," he said. "Where'd you get it?" "Found it in one of the cabins up on the hill," I told him. "I work for the vacation rental agency." He cupped his hands over the window to get a closer look. "Can you open the car door for me?" I unlocked the car. He inspected the knife carefully. "I'll need to take this in," he said. "Evidence." "Evidence of what?" I asked, sliding my hand with the gold band into my pocket. I didn't want him to confiscate that too. "How long have you worked in Point Paradise?" he asked. 6 months. "So you haven't spent a January here?" "No. Every January since I've served as sheriff, someone's gone missing, and I've been the sheriff for a long time." "Where do they go?" I asked. "We don't know," he said. "We never find them." "Is that what happened to the bride?" I asked him. "Who?" "The woman the banker built the cabin for," I clarified. "That was over 100 years ago," he reminded me. "I haven't been the sheriff that long." When I went back inside the coffee shop to finish my poem, the barista shot me an annoyed look. "I'll just be a few minutes," I told her. I sat down with my journal and vanilla latte. I was pleased with my opening line, and after the chaos of that day, finally managed to lose myself in the rhythm of the language. I was so invested in that poem, a sonnet, that I didn't even notice the cold fingers wrap around my ankle. The hand gripped my leg tight and pulled me towards the wall. The chair squealed across the floor, and I tumbled to the ground. The barrister raced out of the back room. "Look what you've done," she said, pointing at the wall. "You put a hole in the wall." "I'm sorry," I said. "I have spackle in my car if you want me to." "I don't want you to do anything," she said, annoyed. "Just leave." "I should really fix this," I told her. She pointed to the door. "Get out." I closed my journal and hurried out of the coffee shop. In bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the hole I'd made. I needed to know what was on the other side. But when I arrived in town, late that night, Greg's truck was parked outside the coffee shop. A single light was on. I got out of my car and walked up to the window. Greg was spackling the hole shut. "What are you doing?" I asked. He let out a little yelp and turned around. "Geez, you scared me." "Why are you patching it up?" "That's my job," Greg said. "I patch up holes." Near Greg's shoe, not far from the hole, I spotted a bloody tooth. "What's that?" I asked, pointing at the tooth. "Oh shoot, I must have missed one." He picked the tooth up. "Where'd it come from?" He put down his putty knife and set his hands on my shoulders. "Beautiful as it is, this land is angry with us, and you can't trust what you see coming out of the walls. It starts as fungus or rodents, but it becomes more sinister. I still hear it calling out to me after all these years, but you got to resist it. Not everyone can." "They got her?" I asked. Greg nodded. I couldn't stay in Point Paradise after that. I drove south and crashed at my friend's place in San Francisco. I tossed and turned on her couch all night, until I realized that Fingerbone was jabbing my side all night. I got up, lifted the window, and tossed that cursed thing into the foggy night. I'm writing all of this from a coffee shop in North Beach. This morning I climbed the stairs of Coit Tower and peered north, towards the redwoods of Point Paradise. I got rid of the bone, but I still have that gold wedding band, the one from the closet. It won't come off. I can feel it pulling me back there, to those holes, those hands, to whatever lies beyond those walls. Well, it has been a few years since I lost my wife to an insidious disease. I used to hate hearing that, but with time and maturity I came to realize that it is true. The people we do not see anymore still live in our hearts. Therefore, not long ago, after coming to terms with such a terrible loss, I had re-established one of our favorite traditions. Last week Sunday, at around 2 in the morning, and equipped with a tasty red wine and a few grapes, I hopped in my boat, precisely a recreational motorboat with an outdoor motor. "Jerry, please don't forget the blankets," she used to remind, so that we do not freeze outside. Just like we used to do together, I drove the boat and stopped it far enough from the coast, lit up a lantern and started feasting on the grapes along with the wine. As I was also scrolling on my phone for pictures of her and pictures of us, so many memories flooded my mind, filling me with joy instead of sadness. At some point, I seemed to feel her presence. Strangely, this is exactly when I noticed it. Further away from the coast, something dark stood firmly on deeper waters of the sea. Struck with amazement and questions, I started the engine and drove up to the strange thing, its outlines and texture getting more clear despite the dark as I got closer, until I realized that it was a small, dark wooden cabin. I stopped the boat some good meters away from it to contemplate that curiosity. How did it stand firmly on the water without moving by an inch is beyond my intelligence. I am not a social media person at all, but that was the kind of things that needed to be seen by millions of people. Amused by the idea, I smiled and tried to take a picture of it first, but my excitement vanished from my heart and face when I noticed that the cabin was not visible on the camera. This was much more serious than I thought. Its only window then opened, revealing a young, pale woman of outstanding beauty with dark hair and an apparently dark dress, gesturing me to approach without saying a word. I asked if she needed any help, but she kept quiet, only gesturing me to approach with an empty expression on her face. When I told her that I was about to go back to the coast instead, her neutral expression gave way to that of anger as her irises shone in a glowing yellow. While looking around in disbelief and starting the engine, preparing to disappear from there, I heard a splashing noise and realized that she was no longer at her window. In fact, the whole cabin had vanished. I then saw something moving fast in the water and approaching the boat at full velocity. I sped off to save my life, and on the way to a safer zone, I felt 2 or 3 bumps under the boat, fortunately without consequences, until I safely reached the coast. Later in the afternoon, when I came to check on my boat, I noticed deep scratching marks under it that seemed to be caused by an unnaturally strong human hand. A clear reason and warning to never again wander late at night on the sea. This is a relatively old story that my dad has told me a few times over the years, but with Halloween coming up it's been on my mind again. I myself have never been able to witness the house, though the description I've been given by multiple men 20-something years after seeing it gave me a very vivid mental image. To begin, I would like to mention that my father is a highly religious man, a preacher's son, and does not believe in ghosts or anything paranormal in the slightest. Nothing seems to spook him either, but he still swears up and down that he felt something unnatural that scared the S out of him, even just from mentioning the story to me on the rare occasion that he would bring it up. Back in the late 80s, he and a few friends would regularly hike over the waterfall creek bed behind our farm, and would follow the trails up until they eventually met the frontage road off of the interstate. Well, one night they decide to take a different route to go around the backside of another farmer's land, mostly to see the animals because they owned emus and other large pets that weren't common in the local area. Supposedly, after leaving the area and continuing into the woods at night of all wonderful times, they managed to stumble upon what is described by all 5 men 20 years later as a Blair Witch lookalike house. It was a very, very old home, and my dad claims that just looking at it gave him this ominous feeling, but of course they had to go inside and check it out. Inside the house was a vintage cottage-style home that was probably built in the late 40s or early 50s, and the group was instantly met with writing and symbols in strange, Latin-like languages with a few English graffiti pieces that quoted a supposed satanic or pagan worshipping ritual with certain pieces describing how to sacrifice a human soul to some supposedly demonic deity. My father still claims to this day that certain symbols were painted on the walls in blood, while others were clearly spray paint, and I find it easier to believe because he also worked as a firefighter for years before this happened, and had a lot of experience with having to see human blood and dismembered bodies on the freeway after car accidents. Past a small living and kitchen area was a stairwell that was so small that their shoulders would physically brush either side of the wall as they went up, and the stairs went straight, stopped at a small landing, then turned right so as you started up you could not see what might be standing at the top. At the top of the stairs a door led to a large attic-style bedroom, where actual chain manacles and locks hung from one of the walls near a circular window at the end of the room, which was also completely covered in weird symbols, graffiti, and now more obvious and frightening large dried puddles of blood that had seeped into the floors and walls. Allegedly, once they were upstairs investigating the room, they swear that they heard someone moving up the stairwell behind them quickly, but when they looked back, there was no one there. Everyone essentially told me that it sounded almost like heels clacking on wood, and now completely spooked, they rushed back down the stairs to see if someone was playing a prank on them and was hiding downstairs. Surprise, surprise, they found nothing and no new footprints in the dust and grime that differed from the ones they left on their way in. To keep things interesting, I met with each of the guys separately to ask them about what they remembered, expecting to maybe find a crack or something to prove that maybe they were exaggerating. But when I asked them, I got the same answer from each of them with no hesitation. They got the same details right down to the minute that they entered the house and the minute they left. But here's where it gets really strange. They left the house and for some unknown reason decided to try walking back from a different route, using a compass to approach from the east instead of the south. They did this test more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction. Yet they always came out at the front entrance of the house, even when the compass and common knowledge of the area showed that it was physically impossible to be at the south end of the house when they moved in a straight line from the north, east, or west. There probably is some scientific explanation for it, but I haven't found one yet. These guys knew those woods literally like the back of their hand and still do to this day. The final time that the guys came back and found themselves standing at the front door of the house, they begin to feel physically ill, verging on feverish, and finally decide that it's time to give up when one of them nearly faints, and as they turn to leave, the man who nearly fainted turns, looks up, and points at the circular window at the front of the house on the second story. Everyone looks and immediately sees a tall female figure hunched over standing in the window watching them, though they see no features on her face other than 2 large dark-colored eyes, and it sort of shuffled in place slight before turning and walking away, as if it were heading to the stairs QT the end of the room. At the sight of the figure actually moving, they all took off running through the woods, ending up on the side of the interstate about 3 miles from my dad's house, where they originally started from. They eventually made it back to my dad's place, though they claimed that they felt as if someone were following them the entire way, and my dad's cousin gets up to get some water from the kitchen, only to announce that he swore that he saw the same figure standing outside of the kitchen window, near the edge of the woods close to the woodshed. Thankfully, nothing ever came from the experience other than a collective state of absolute terror when the subject is brought up. They wrote off what his cousin saw as paranoia or pareidolia, though 5 years later they decided to return to see if the house was still standing. Miraculously, it had fallen in on itself and was nothing more than a pile of rubble, and they never went back. I always joked with my dad and would ask him what he would do if he went back and found the house standing the same way it had back then, trying to give him a reason to let me go and see the place for myself. But with trespassing laws being far more prevalent in today's times, it would be nearly impossible without either getting shot or going to jail, as it was not on our property. I don't know. It always gives me the creeps thinking about it. But I never considered the story to be true until I did this little mock interview with all of the guys. And when I say that these grown men are scared to death by this story, I mean it. Seeing them get physically worked up and frightened by just telling the story really caused me to be less of a skeptic. What do you guys think? Could it possible that they were just spooked and it caused them to see things?
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.